Morning in Meereen began like the drawing of a slow breath. Heat lifted first, the day's first exhale from sun-warmed brick and pale mortar, and with it the scent of baked dates and river reeds, and something sharper, a bitterness that clung to the low city where the night kept its bruises. From the terrace above her audience hall, Daenerys watched the city bringing itself awake. Courtyards spat out boys with baskets and women in veils. A donkey brayed beneath the shade of a drooping silk awning. Far off, the harborside cranes creaked, and beyond them the water met the morning like polished glass. She stood long enough to feel sweat bead at her temples. The breeze could not find her. She had not slept well. Dreams had come in uneasy pieces, all edges and color, a chorus of burning and the clash of bronze, the hiss of scales. In one of them, her brother, never the brother she remembered but always the one she had lost and feared, paced circles around a wedding diadem and called it a collar. She was certain the dream would sit in her skull all day like a coin you could not spit out. When she closed her eyes, she still saw the hall's pale pillars, the line of Dornishmen below them, the boy who was not a boy but a prince, solemn mouth and freckles under salt-weathered skin. And how he stepped forward and did not sway on his feet, no matter the whispering behind fans and tokers. If there were gods in this city, they had caring little to say of him. Yet he had spoken with a plainness she had not heard in months. Quentyn Martell had ridden across sand and salt in the belief that what had once been sworn still held its shape, that words bound men at the ankle long after they forgot who had tied the knot. He had stood with his companions, Garrus Drinkwater with his amber grin, and the big Euronwood knight, who seemed carved from the same rock as his country's cliffs, and offered her a marriage as if he were offering bread and water. Not a bribe, not a bargain, but something homely and necessary, that you set down in front of those you wish to keep alive. When he spoke of Dorne and of his father's promise, Daenerys had felt an ache she had learned to ignore rise like a tide. It was the ache of Westeros spoken of as if it were not a fairy tale. It had a sun and a spear in its seal, and blood spilled in its history like oil on water, pooled and spreading, refusing to be blinked away. Missandei found her late in the morning with a measure of figs and barley cakes, and recited quietly the names of those waiting below. The Green Grace as ever, Resnek Mo Resnak, whose smile shook like a catfish you were trying to hold in wet hands. Skahaz Mo Kandak, who scowled so dutifully one wondered if he ever took the mask off even in sleep. The Dornish prince waited again. Missandei added, as if his waiting were a fresh fact rather than the continuation of yesterday. Barristan Selmy stood with him as counsel and bridge between styles of honor. Daenerys ate without tasting and carried with her down the steps the feeling of eyes. To rule here was to be watched. To do anything was to call down the opinion of those who would not dirty their shoes in the alleys she crossed. The hall's light had a washed quality by midday, as if the sun itself had been strained through silk. The prince bowed again. He did not flinch when the whisper of frog traveled up the aisle like a dry leaf. His hands were sun-brown with pale scars and heavier at the knuckles than those of a scribe or courtier. That, she thought, was the only beauty the city admitted. The beauty of use. "We spoke last night," she said, and had the odd awareness of her own voice, as if it were assembled for the occasion. Some queens must spend their entire lives listening to their voices. "We will speak again more quietly. I would hear every word that was given in your father's name." "Your Grace," Quentyn replied, and when he raised his head there were lines at the corners of his eyes that belonged to someone older. "There is more ink than I would choose, but the line is straight. The letter we carried is not the only witness. Men lived those promises and bled for them too." "And would bleed again?" Skahaz inquired, and the iron in his voice gave Daenerys a certain comfort. The Shayvapat's bluntness had the virtue of being exactly what it was. "If the cause is just," said Quentyn, "if it is ours." The Green Grace's fingers nested together like a flock of white birds. "Meereen is not Dorne. Our customs flow from other springs." "Customs can be learned," Garrus said amiably. And Resnek flapped a silk handkerchief in mortal alarm that anyone but those with titles might speak. The big Euronwood knight only looked at Quentyn as one would follow the set of a banner in fitful wind. Daenerys dismissed the hall sooner than she wished, and brought the Dornish into a small garden that crept like a veil around the base of one of the palace towers. The fountain's music was thin. The water eddied around a statue whose face had once been broken and repaired, the seam visible as a pale suture across the cheek. She sat on the edge of the basin and let her fingers drift into the coolness. When the men had seated, she nodded at Barristan, who leaned against a column like the memory of a tree. "Prince Quentyn," she said, not knowing until the words were between them that she had chosen. "I have seen Melkart's bells offered to me and songs of honey poured in my ear. I have been told that to be a wife to Meereen, I must wear the city like a tokar and never step in it. The only road I saw each day was the road that ran in a circle. If I accept you, I will offend those who have desired my favor for the health of their purses. If I refuse you, I will offend those whose blood was spilled for something I am bound to by birth and memory and grief. I was born of a house that had a Martell for its queen once and children, whose deaths became the banner by which a kingdom marched. If I marry you, your father will hold me to it." "Bem?" "My father will honor what you honor," said Quentyn. "He has little of himself left. That is not his promises." A kind of fragile peace took shape within her then, like the shadow of a bird passing over a fountain. It was not joy. It was not the bright doom of desire, the fever that Dario Naharis had held in his teeth when he smiled. It was a quiet with edges. She had learned to value such quiet. "Then I accept you," she said, and had the absurd thought that she could feel the entire city take a step closer, 1,000 ears leaning in. "I will make this marriage for Dorne and for all the dead who cannot be returned to. And for the living I wish to bring home. I will not be the wife of Meereen. I will be its queen while I am here, but I will not be its wife." Garrus laughed once, softly, as if it relieved some private pressure only his bones understood. The big knight bowed his head. Quentyn only looked at her with a relief so deep it did not know how to surface. Missandei's hands fluttered and then steadied, and Barristan's breath left him as though he had been wearing too much armor. "We will need witnesses," Daenerys said, "and oaths we both can keep. I will not wear a tokar." "Nor I," said Quentyn, and his mouth almost smiled. "I have never learned to walk in coils." The next days were taken from her by ceremony. The green grace arrived with acolytes, a procession of soft feet and fervent nodding, to remind her that Meereen possessed 1,000 years of ways to solemnize unions. Priests of a dozen gods and goddesses would be offended if not included. It would be wise to share offense evenly. Resnack catalogued dignitaries as if they were spices on a shelf. Skahaz pulled aside the veil of piety to show her where knives might be hidden, the alleys through which hope could be strangled. She learned that to marry was to turn a city into a mirror. Everyone wished to see their own face reflected. In the hours that were not tied together with silk, Quentyn learned the palace's paths with the plodding steadiness of a man who had walked desert with a skin of sour water and thought it a blessing. He did not crowd her. He made himself available without weight. He murmured something to a boy who was sweeping. He helped a kitchen maid lift an amphora that would have broken her back. He stood in the doorway to the dragon cellars more than once, and each time asked permission to descend. On the second day she went with him, the air beneath the earth smelling of ash and the oldest copper. Viserion and Rhaegal unfurled in their darkness, like green and white sails catching a wind that had never troubled the surface. Chains rasped. Iron's particular small thunder. Rhaegal stared with lids that closed from the side, as if the world were a thing to be shuddered. Viserion tasted the air with a tongue that reminded her always of a wound clearing itself. She touched their necks one after the other, letting them know that what approached them did so under her peace. Quentyn hung back, hands empty and visible. He did not ask to mount them. He did not say the old nonsense men said about the blood of dragons and who possessed enough of it to master fire. He stood and let his breath find the slow rhythm of the place. He watched how they watched. He kept his fear out of his scent. She knew then that he had not come for a dragon, not even to die impressively under one. He had come for her, and for the unglamorous line of obligation that linked his father's bed and this warm breathing darkness. That knowledge did him more good in her eyes than any poetry would have. Above ground, the palace arranged itself around the wedding like a market making way for a show. There were fruit pyramids that changed shape as quickly as hands stole from them. There were musicians who could switch to Meereenese scales when the priests approached, and drift back toward Dornish airs as soon as they left. There were tailors and weavers and hairdressers who had never held a hair like hers, and fretted quietly over how to make it look as if they had. The Green Grace proposed that significant rites be performed in the Great Pyramid, the Dornish in a garden. Daenerys said yes to most things to leave herself room for the few she meant to refuse, absolutely. She had Missandei draw up a ritual that could be translated without becoming hollow and clearly stated the terms of her fealty. She would join the House of Martell without leaving her own. She would carry Dorne into Westeros. She would not subject her rule to the Green Grace weaving. Dario saw the changes like a man who smelled winter for the first time. He had grown too sure of the spring. He came to her one evening with a scull of wine and a string of blue silk he twisted around his fingers until it creased his skin. He never begged. That was not his way. He reminded her of the fun of riding out and cutting a man off his horse. He reminded her that no one would sing of houses that counted and measured, and that she herself had been a coin in no one's pocket when she stood in the red waste and told the sun to move aside. He was not cruel. He had never learned how to offer what he could not keep. She kissed his forehead the way one kisses a feverish child and sent him away with orders that the stormcrows should be on the walls at dawn. When the door closed between them, she felt nothing for a little while. And then the ache found her. She thought of her brother again, and of how he had wanted a crown that would stop the world's mouth from laughing. She thought of Drogo, and how much of her had been minted in his fire. She thought of the man who had died in her arms in that black tent, and the women who had spat truer things at her than most men ever dared. In their different fashions, they had all taught her. She did not know if she was learning the right lessons, only that she could not afford to stop. Barristan Selmy asked to walk with her along the outer terrace the afternoon before the wedding. His hair looked like it had been cut with scrupulous care and no vanity. He had the gift of speaking as if he were sitting where she was sitting. It was one reason why she trusted him, that he could make himself small enough to look up at a queen. "When I served your father," he began, and she lifted a hand, and he smiled and amended. "When I served men who served your father, there were lords who would have slit their own feet rather than step onto Dornish sand. They despised the sun and the food and the sight of women without the bindings they believed ordained. They despised Dorne because they could not make it admire them in return. The men of your house who loved Aelia were of a different fabric. They understood that Dorne kept its own counsels. If you marry into that, your grace, you will gain not obedience but stubborn loyalty. The one must be renewed like a bribe, the other endures, but it has its own speed. You will not spur Dorne. You must ride in their company. They will go far." And she watched two children outside the palace chase a dog under a cart. Their shrieks turned liquid with distance. "Do you approve?" "I approve of anything that anchors you to Westeros, without tying you to men who would sell you back to yourself. He is not much to look at. That is a blessing." She laughed then, a small sound she had not expected. "When you were young, Sir Barristan, did you believe the handsome had a better claim on fate? When I was young, I believed fate wore livery." He hesitated. "When you go, your grace, there will be those who tell you Meereen will fall tomorrow if you leave today. They will tell you this tomorrow and the day after. They will not stop. Your mercy can be made to obey like a dog. Your purpose will not. You must know which leash you hold and which holds you." She put her hand on his arm and found his steadiness there. In her sleep that night, she stood on a shore where the water burned cold and the sand burned hot, and a black cat watched her with yellow eyes as if she were a piece of interesting driftwood. When she woke, the sky had softened. Somewhere a harp practiced scales. She dressed in something that did not belong to Meereen and did not try to pretend that it did. The cloth was light, nearly white. Its trim took the colors of both her banners and Dorne's. A thread of crimson that glowed when the sun touched it, a thread of orange that seemed to hold light inside itself. She braided her hair with coins and small drops of pale green glass that would nod when she nodded, and would not slice skin if she embraced a child. The rites were a weaving because they had to be. The Green Grace inscribed circles in air with water from the river, and burned resin that smelled of citrus and old books. A man who had traveled with Quentyn and spoke for Dorne scattered sand from a bag whose neck was tied with a sun-colored cord. "From our shores to yours," he said, and the Myrianese hissed that the city had no shores. A strange little man with black teeth clacked a pair of shells and chanted something in a language Missandei's face changed at, translating it into a benediction so clean it felt like washing. When it came time to speak, Daenerys did not speak the names of gods she did not recognize. She spoke of the dead, Aelia, who had been a Martell and had died for a Targaryen, Rhaegar, whose harp had been mistaken for a sword, Riella and Eris, for whom she would not lie, Drogo, whose body had been a map she had learned, her unborn son, whose name she said in the silence that followed like a drop fall, the freedman who had walked unshod to lay stones in walls, the boy she had fed her dragons. She offered all of this and her hand. Quentyn offered his father's seal and the water of the water gardens in a small glass vial. She saw how his fingers shook and steadied. She saw how the big knight looked at him then, and how Garrus tried to look at everything, and not at the same time. They touched hands. They did not kiss for the crowd. The applause was the sound a city makes when it is not sure it is safer than it was yesterday. The music afterward was better than she had expected. Someone had found a man who could play an oud as if it were speaking of distant gulls. He played while the nobles watched, and while the children tired themselves and fell asleep on the marble in nested commas of pink feet. Later, in the room where she had taught herself to write letters that could be folded without breaking, Quentyn stood in the doorway and did not come further without invitation. He looked around the room as if it were a garden whose paths he did not wish to trample. She asked him about Dorne because it was easier to speak of places than of their bodies, and because she wanted to hear the place in his voice rather than in a steward's list. He told her of the water gardens at sunset, when everything was the same color until you looked closely enough and saw that nothing was the same as the thing beside it. He spoke of oranges packed into baskets for winter, and of wind that tasted of stone. He had a way of making beauty sound like something you could eat. "Do you love it?" she asked, and he tilted his head and took his time. "I love that it keeps its promises," he said. "The sun comes back where it went down. The water is where the water was yesterday, and if it is not, the children tell you. I have loved it better since I left it." And no. She undid a coin from her hair and set it on the table between them. The metal was warm. "I want what you offer," she said. "Not for the tightness it puts around my finger, but because I cannot afford to stand without something like it. I did not marry you to be saved. I married you so I could walk with both my feet. I have never saved anyone," he said, and then surprised them both by smiling. "I once helped a goatherd find his goat. It made more difference than anything I had done that year." She laughed because she could not stop herself. "That is a good beginning," she said. She touched his wrist. He looked down as if the touch might be a trick, and then looked up again with something careful in his eyes, an animal listening for the depth of the forest. She let her hand fall away, and they spoke until the candles were low. When he left, he bowed with a small awkwardness that made him dearer. The city woke the next day to a thinning of patience. The sons of the Harpy did not bless unions. They found a half-dozen freedmen on their way to market and opened their throats as if chalking a door. The heads were set where heads were always set, because men who kill for the shape of the world love to make patterns. Skahaz had the bodies gathered in baskets. He said little. Dario had already ridden twice along the wall by the time she joined him, his smile smaller and more cutting for being hard-earned. Yunai's banners were visible to the south like sullen moths. Trade dribbled through marine streets like thin syrup. And still the people lived, and that was an insult to more precise men than she. A woman taught her daughter to knead dough on a flat stone. 2 boys hollowed out a watermelon with a spoon, arguing about whose turn it was to hold the rind. Meereen persisted in being alive. Quentyn requested leave to ride with the Stormcrows in the mornings. He did not sparkle in the saddle as Dario did not cut an elegant figure, but soldiers liked him. He kept his seat. He listened when men spoke, and remembered what they said. He accepted water when offered, and did not take the largest gulp. He asked questions whose answers had practical use. He did not pretend to have led armies, and so the men did not feel obliged to pretend to admire him. When he returned, he ate where the guards ate, and only later where the table had place for a prince. Daenerys watched it happen. this acceptance that had nothing to do with pageantry, and thought he could grow strong if fed the right food. At night, she bled her worries onto paper and sealed them with wax and Quentyn's seal and sent them out across sand to a father she had not met. She told Doran Martell that she would not return a son to him unchanged. She told him what she meant to do and what she would not do. She named men in Meereen whom she would not trust with her sleep. She asked for sails, not men, which she knew Doran would husband to its own purpose, but wood and tar, and the skill of riggers, which cost silver and time. She asked for messengers up the coast to arrange for safe harbors where Dornish colors would not be set on fire by accident. She asked for tidings of lords who still whispered the Targaryen name as prayer or curse. She asked for patience if the answers came late. The answers could not come quickly. What came quickly was rumor. The bay had always been a mouth for news. Now it gossiped like a fishwife. Ships cutting low in the water, old banks of oars pulling together. A fleet of black sails glossed like seals. Men with iron in their beards, iron at their throats, iron in the words they used when asked their destination. There might be krakens at the edge of the horizon, and with them a horn the color of old bruises. Merchants who had seen Volantis spoke of slave legions, marching as if stitched to a single drum. Someone claimed to have watched a man in a red cloak speaking to a god in a candle. When she spoke with Barristan, the old knight's silence felt heavy enough to have a price. And when he finally said, "It is the way of war come in waves," she took that as the prayer it was. The first moment she took Quentyn down to the dragon pit alone after the wedding, the air felt denser, as if the earth had exhaled and found no one to take its breath. They went without guards, only Missandei, who would not let her walk anywhere she did not know the names of. Light fell in thin bars from the grills above, dust dancing in it like tired snow. Rhaegal turned his head, and Viserion opened his mouth. Not a yawn, but something like one. A stretch of flame's idea of a hello. Quentyn stood at the edge of their reach, and then moved closer by half a step, careful to show his hands. "Men in my country learn to move slowly when a snake is sleeping," he said, almost a whisper. "It is not the snake you wake who kills you, but the one who does not seem to notice. These are not snakes," she said, and smiled. "Because calling dragons by lesser names seemed a safe thing today. They have moods. I recognize them before I understand them." "What mood is this?" "Expectation," she said. "They know the scent of me, and they know a stranger who is with me. They are waiting to decide which name to put on you. I have not come to take from them what belongs to them," he said, looking up into Rhaegal's green as if contemplating a cliff face. "But if you ask me to stand next to you while you hold them, I will." She found that this too was a kind of strength. She had known men who would leap in hope the air turned to water beneath them. She had known men who would not move without 10 witnesses and 3 oaths to record it. Quentyn had the patience to make his way step by step along a narrow ledge. She showed him how to lift his hand and open his palm and keep his fingers quiet. She let him offer a piece of burnt meat that he did not drop when the heat licked his wrist. Viserion considered him and took the meat and let his teeth shave the edge of Quentyn's callus. When they climbed back to daylight, her lungs drank it like forgiveness. Sickness walked after as it always did, the pale mare dragging its hooves through the camps beyond the walls. Healers came to her with hands dyed blue-black from their herbs and asked for more of everything. She gave them what she could and understood that it was not enough. If she had been a god, and she did not want to be, she would have picked up the misery like a woolen shawl and shaken it until the lice fell out. She could not. She could only make laws as if men would obey them, punish those who did not as if more would not replace them, and sleep as if the city would wake up where she had left it. Sometimes at night she felt the absence of Drogon like a tooth worrying her tongue. She had not seen her fierce child since the day the sun had screamed him out of the pit. The sky felt too quiet. Hizdard Zolorak came to congratulate her in a robe that advertised the length of its owner's patience and a smile that never reached his eyes. He spoke as if the words had been measured against a line and trimmed to fit. He told her she had chosen something not unsuited to her station, and that Marine loved all unions that did not diminish itself. The green grace pressed him forward with the same polite force a gardener used with a trellis. Daenerys accepted the civility as she had accepted venom in bowls, acknowledging only the part that would not burn the tongue. Skahaza's scowl grew so profound that it began to feel like furniture. As the marriage became a fact sturdy enough to rest things upon, the shape of her rule changed. Those who had been waiting to betray her in the way the city understood betrayal, by convincing her that Marine was the only place that breathed, found themselves facing a queen who had planted one foot elsewhere. Somehow this made her both closer and further. Men who had grown fat on the river trade resented that she could imagine a different tide. The poor resented less. They had always imagined other places. News of Dorne took on a color that made other rooms seem dimmer. A child brought to the palace a crude wooden spear and said his father had made it, and asked if Dorne used such spears. Someone smuggled in a basket of oranges as if it were contraband and stood at a distance and watched her eat one, tears shining in the man's eyes when she bit into sourness and laughed. Quentyn began to spend an hour each day with Missandei and a scribe, learning to read the crisscrossing script of Kaskari law. He said he had no talent for it, and then proved he had a talent for endurance by returning even when his head hurt. He visited the healing tents outside the walls, and came back with sudden rages, like dust devils, when he spoke of what he had seen. He played tiles with Barristan, and lost with good humor, and learned quickly how to lose less. He wrote letters home that said more with what they left out. The big knight, Archibald, sparred with Grey Worm, and the two men moved in practice with the caution and respect of men who had learned most of what they knew through pain. The first time she felt truly married to Quentyn, it had nothing to do with a bed, though there was a bed, and they spent nights together as ships might share a harbor before venturing again into water that belonged to neither. It happened when a delegation from Yunkai offered her an exchange that tasted of old iron. They would lift the siege if she delivered back to them those who had fled their masters under the three cities' banners. They would leave with their honor intact. Those were the words. And the peace would be a brick in the road she claimed to build. The Green Grace argued that peace required the swallowing of unpleasant shapes. Hisdar offered Marianese proverbs about the wisdom of streams that bend. Resnak complained of the smell of the camps and asked if they would leave their mules. Skahaz reached for his knife, as if he could cut the suggestion into its pieces, and name them individually. Daenerys stared at the men from Yunkai until her eyes burned, and saw that there was nothing there that she could rob them of with her gaze. They were salesmen of their own lives. When she spoke, she did not call them names. She told them she had no power to return people they had lost. She had not bought them, and so she could not sell them. The words felt clean in her mouth. Quentyn said nothing during the exchange, but when it was over and they had left, and the room had shrunk to the size of those who remained, he spoke a single time. In Dorne there was once a lord, he said, who had a wall that his neighbor demanded be moved. Everyone had an idea where the wall should go. The lord moved the wall only when he understood that he had built it on a spring. It was going to move without him. After, in the quiet that followed, they did not touch as lovers do to mark a decision with skin. They sat on the floor, back against the same couch, and let their shoulders find one another. He smelled faintly of saffron from the lunch the cooks had pressed on him. She had never expected that scent to carry comfort, but it did. Outside, the afternoon thickened like hot wax. News arrived the way wounds do, asymmetrically, and with a narrative supplied afterward. The Iron Fleet's sails were seen at dusk. Then half of them were seen by morning. A ship limped into the mouth of the Skahazadon with men whose eyes had looked too long into the same thought. They brought with them stories of a horn that made other horns seem like clay whistles. The tattered prince, when he came to her, asked for a city, as a man might ask for a cup, with so little ornament that she wondered if she had misheard. She sent him away with her refusal wrapped in silk and thought, not for the first time, that there is a way men ask for the world as if the world were not already owned by the dead and the hungry. Somewhere closer than Volantis, Tyrion Lannister played at being small and was less successful at it now that he was lost. She did not know his name on the wind yet, did not know the shape the world had built him into since last She had heard of him as a clever monster who had saved a city and been thrown out of it like offal. She only felt sometimes, when she looked east into the rising glare, that the world was moving toward her with intent. The night Victorian scouts were said to have sounded their oars offshore, and the men with the kraken on their sails were seen at anchor. Daenerys could not sleep. She walked the palace as she had learned to walk deserts, counting her steps and listening for where her feet had made a sister out of her shadow. She found Quentyn in the room with no chairs where she sometimes went to hear herself breathe. He did not always understand the ways she had taught herself to survive, but he did not ask her to surrender them. He held in his hands a small carved lion someone had given him as a charm. He was turning it around as if what he sought lay on the side he had not seen yet. "They will test us," he said without turning. "They will test everything. They always do before they decide whether to be lazy or to die. Bah. We are being watched by men who do not see what is here," she said. "They see themselves with our walls drawn around them." He looked at her then. "It helps to know what we are. The Martells have a saying. It is not especially flattering. My mother used to joke that we were a stubborn weed. No one wants to plant us, but we fill all the cracks. So, if they planted me..." she said, thinking of the tokar and the coils and the priests who told her where a woman might breathe. "We carry our own water," he said, and then, after a moment, "You are more than the shape of your marriage. So are you," she said, and made room for him without quite touching. They sat and listened to the mosquitoes sing at the grills until the dark thinned. Days arranged themselves around new habits. The council included more silence and fewer monologues. Messengers moved between the ships and the shore. The Ironborn with their blunt proposals and their promises that tasted like salt and rot. Yunkish envoys who changed their terms as often as sweaty men shift in bed. Sellsword captains who could only keep their oaths if their hands stayed on them. She saw in their faces that they were all trying to calculate the same equation. When would she leave, and what would be worth more when she did? The answer was not a number she could give them. She woke every day with the same two weights in either hand: the people who would die if she stayed, and the people who would die if she went. It was a balance so cruel, it might have been a jest. She cooked that cruelty to a smaller size in the pots of law and bread and water and murder. She set punishments and made examples and held long funerals for some and small ones for many. She walked the streets. She let herself be seen and spoke to those who spoke back, because rumor adores a vacuum. She pressed coins into a child's palm and told him to buy bread for his mother. And the boy stared at her and said, "She will have no teeth by the time you go." One morning, at her request, Quentyn stood by her in the hall while the freedmen gathered to tell her that the men with spears who wore no collars were still men with spears. That sometimes the whip had no handle. That sometimes fear filled all the jars you had just emptied. He listened until he understood the names of the men they hated, and the names of the men they feared, and the names of the men they wanted to be. Afterward, he said nothing grand. He had the scribes write a list and read it back to her, and made corrections where the names were wrong. Then he asked the unsullied commander for a mess of men to stand at 3 corners of a certain market at certain times and simply be. He did not declare a policy. He built a footpath and then walked it to see if it would hold his weight. The day she took him flying, if it could be called that, they did not find Drogon. He was wherever wild things went when they wanted to remind you that they did not belong to you. They climbed instead to the roof and stood in wind until their hair was whipped into whatever shape the air chose. The city spread below like a problem arranged with exquisite care. The river gleamed like a boundary drawn in stubborn ink. He leaned his hands on the parapet and said, "When I first rode across the sand to find you, I thought I would become larger as I came closer. I do not know why. Now I think I have shrunk, and that is not entirely bad. Kings forget how small they are," she said. "Queens especially. They build rooms that fit only pride. Now, my father says a prince should cultivate naps and the habit of getting out of the way. Your father has lived a long time. He learned it from his father, who learned it from a woman whose name we did not keep. Every house's history is full of women we did not keep. It is a crime for which there is no restitution. Perhaps this marriage can be the beginning of some small accounting. She had not married him for this, and yet she felt that something important had brushed her shoulder, a butterfly or a ghost. Letters began to return from the west on paper folded and unfolded so many times that their corners had become soft as cloth. Doran Martell's hand was precise to the point of severity. He thanked her for her words. He offered the names of shipmasters who would sell their parents for a cargo and the names of those who would not sell their souls. He told her what houses had grown quiet under Lannister dominion and which merely feigned it. In a line that took her breath away, he wrote of Elia and how his hand had shaken writing her name 20 years and more. He did not flatter her. He did not threaten. He positioned himself as a man who would stand where he had said he would stand, and expected the world to move around him, like weather around a mountain. There was also a postscript in a different hand, written in a taller, faster script that broke into loops when impatient. It said only, "Oranges are dear this year, and the children ask if you like them." She wrote back that she did, and that she liked even the bitter ones, which were not meant to be eaten but learned from. She had Missandei write the letter 3 times until it sounded like what she meant. On an evening that left the sky the color of bruised plums, the green grace brought Daenerys a prayer dressed as a warning. Many strong men were gathering nearby. Meereen had survived a great deal. It would not survive forever. Ties to Westeros were air, unless pulled taut with rope. The city might forgive a marriage to a foreign prince if that prince made himself useful in Merry's eyes. To make himself useful, he must make himself Meereenese. A small temple was to be consecrated in the prince's name. Perhaps he could accept certain honors. Perhaps he could be seen eating certain dishes, wearing certain colors, visiting certain men's houses. The advice felt like having a noose flung to you as a kindness. Quentyn listened, nodded after each item, and then politely threw back the noose. "I am a prince of Dorne," he said, and the green grace's face lost a shade of its calm. "If it pleases the queen, I will eat your stews and wear your ribbons and speak in your halls. I will not pretend to be of you, because I am not. That is an insult to both of us." "I can be your ally, your grace," he said to Daenerys when they were alone. "I cannot be your disguise." She wanted to kiss him for that, and did not. She wanted to tell him that there are days when a disguise is the only way a woman walks through a city without losing her face. She did not. She looked instead at the cups and the fruit on the table, and chose an orange and peeled it, strip by strip, inhaling the spray of it like a tonic. In the weeks that followed, the slow turning of events began to take on the sound of a wheel catching a rut. The Ironborn tested the outer escorts with a feint, and the freedmen on the river's mouth proved they could drown as bravely as any lords if asked to stand and catch arrows to keep the grain barges moving. The tattered prince changed his price twice and then twice again. The small gods of Meereen argued with the large gods of Meereen about whether the plague was an insult or a lesson. A bag of silver went missing from the palace and appeared 3 days later under a step visited only by barefoot children. Grey Worm stood at the edge of her council and said nothing twice, and then, on the 3rd day, said one sentence that made a plan out of a pile of wishes. Barristan taught Quentyn a feint that the young man could not master, and they both laughed. Missandei learned a new way to say no that sounded like a blessing. There were nights when Daenerys slept and dreamed of home, and the home changed its face. It was not always the house with the red door. Sometimes it was a courtyard filled with water and children. Sometimes a saddle turned to face the direction she needed to go. Sometimes the sound of a black cat knocking a jug off a ledge in the dark, and the way laughter solved nothing but made a night bearable. Sometimes it was Drogon's shadow over a camp, and the cries that followed. She would wake with the taste of ash and the echo of a horn that had not yet sounded in her council chamber. When the horn did sound, it came from a ship not her own, and shook the air like a hand passing over a drum. Birds stuttered out of the date palms. Men stopped and set down their baskets as if told to by an old voice. She stood at the parapet and thought, That is a sound made to make men remember who they are afraid to be. Quentyn joined her, and they stood with the city spread beneath them. He did not reach for his sword. It would have been a farce. He reached instead for the parapet, and held it as one holds a friend who might fall. "I have a thought," he said, and it was not a plan. It was nothing so clean. It was a net cast lightly onto a piece of water to see how it lay. "We have waited for the world to bring to us all its weapons. Perhaps we should choose which we accept." "Then? You mean to turn someone away?" She did not need to say who. There were only so many someones. "I mean to make the choice appear ours," he said. "If the music is loud enough, men mistake the dance they are asked to step into as their own. We could take a step and make it seem as if the others followed." She thought of Rhaegal's eye, and how it saw the shape of her before it saw her face. She thought of the men gathered below under their banners, each of whom had a story he carried like a sword and a 3-word summary of what he wanted that made him feel simpler than he was. She thought of Dorne, of the water gardens, of children who did not know yet what their adults kept alive for them. "We will need a drum of our own," she said. "We have one," he said. You are the drum." It was the silliest thing she had heard in a week, and perhaps the truest. She closed her eyes and let the foolishness sit in her chest until it found its place among the other truths. Quieter, but stubborn, they descended into a day that asked much. The council fanned out. The sellswords flowed in and out, like fishermen checking the tide. Grey Worm rotated posts with the tenderness of a man moving injured birds. The Green Grace sent honeyed men twice, and then did not send again. Hisdar counted the fruit, and found the pile changing shape beneath his hands. There were moments when she wanted only to sit on the floor, and trace with her finger the seams in the stone, until she had memorized their exact course. There were moments when Quentyn's plainness saved her, because he did not ask for any special drama to explain what they were required to do. "We will stand here tomorrow," he said, measuring the step of the wall with his stride. "We will hold here. We will move when there is a path." End. That night, under a sky that had forgotten it could be blue, Daenerys went to the dragon pit alone and sat with her back to the iron gate, listening to the restless metal. The dragons were not asleep. They were thinking in the way their bodies thought, through heat and hunger and the constant arithmetic of strength. She spoke aloud to them of Orphan's Bay and of the sea beyond it, of white towers she had seen only in stories and red ones she had claimed by blood, of the man she had married and the man she had not, of men who offered horns and men who offered hands. She said their names and then did not say them, as if that could protect them. Beyond the gate, chains shifted. She felt stupid, and the queen of all stupidity, and then, oddly, consoled. There is a kind of strength in knowing that all you can do is make a plan for dawn, and then keep it. Quentyn found her there, and did not come closer than the edge of her shadow. "We have sent the messengers," he said, "and the answer has sent a kind of silence back. It is loud." "Everything is loud," she said. "I am trying to be quiet." "We are good at quiet," he said. "It is not a heroic skill, but it is ours." She turned then, and looked at him in the lantern's low circle, and saw the man she had married in something like his native light. There had been no thunder when she took his hand. There had been no drums. There had been this. A drink given to a thirsty woman, a stone that did not move when she leaned. He could not give her the sky. He could set his shoulder to the ground beneath her feet and make it less likely to buckle. When she reached out, she did so with a simplicity that surprised her. He came to her with the same. Their bodies found a shape that would not shame either of them. There was no revelation, only relief, and the blessing of not having to pretend to hunger she did not possess for a form she did not desire. He slept afterward as he did everything else, cleanly and with his whole weight. She lay awake and watched the patterns the lantern made on the ceiling, and listened to the dragons shift and the city turn over and dream. The wind changed at last. It did not bring good news. It brought the smell of rain that did not know how to fall. It brought a rumor that the Ironborn had taken 3 ships with fewer men than common sense would permit. It brought word that Yunkai now called their demands conditions. as if changing words altered the taste of them. It brought a letter from Doran whose seal had broken in heat, whose contents did not. He would send her 10 ships in the first wave, then 4 more, then 2, in case the world became quieter and men braver. He urged patience without condescension. He did not offer men. He did not need to say why. She took the letter to the terrace and read it aloud to the air, because she wanted the city to know that she did not belong to it entirely. By then, when she walked the corridors, she did so with Quentyn half a step to one side, and Barristan half a step to the other. And men counted themselves lucky if they walked behind such a straight line. Grey Worm did not change his pace for princes. Missandei corrected Quentyn's Kiskari declensions without awe. The big knight learned the word for water in 6 languages spoken in the market, and could be seen loudly mispronouncing them for children who shrieked with delight, and then taught him again. Garrus acquired a following of women who liked his face, and the way he borrowed words from any tongue, and made them sound like something you could put in a wine cup. When the storm finally came, it did so without spectacle, as if it had been waiting for a cue and then shrugged and began. In the rain, Meereen became a different city. Oil ran in rainbows in the streets. The guards looked shorter. The children looked taller. The sons of the Harpy had more trouble climbing. The plague sputtered and then, perversely, grew worse. The kitchens smelled of boiled flowers. The dragons were restless, and the iron of their chains sang in a lower key. Daenerys stood in a doorway and let the rain braid her hair, and thought of a girl running barefoot on polished stone, and a woman stepping out of a tent into a world that had been set on fire by her grief. Quentyn returned from the wall with mud up to his knees, and a look of intent puzzlement that meant someone had said something to him he could not yet use. He took off his boots and left them in a line with 5 other pairs, an ordinary act that moved her more than any kneeling crowd. "They are trying to make a point," he said. "They think we do not see it. I think we do. I think we must pretend not to, and then step on it." "What point?" "That they can be patient too." He smiled without humor. "We are not the only ones with quiet. They will not be patient if the wind favors them," she said. "It never does for long," he said. "That is the mercy of the world." That night, she dreamt again. Dragons moved beneath the earth the way old kings move in ink, and she rode nothing, walked nothing, only stood and watched. Men on ships blew horns that changed the shapes of flames. A woman in a green veil touched her cheek with a wet finger and drew a circle. The circle did not close. She woke with a taste of orange on her tongue and the distant human sound of someone crying, as if it had been a long time since they had done it, and they were surprised by how it felt. Morning dragged itself into being. Messages had piled up like drift. Victarion Greyjoy, who had sent a letter that behaved as if it had been written with an anchor, proposed a driftwood alliance. Ships for dragons, power bound to power with rope rather than silk. The tattered prince asked a 5th time for the city he claimed he wanted more than life. The Volantinese wrangled among themselves in columns of neat script. Doran's next letter moved west with terrible slowness. Barristan brought her news of men who wanted to change sides the way fish want to change water. Grey Worm folded a map and refolded it so that it stopped creasing in the wrong place. Quentyn stood with his hand on the table's edge and said nothing until she looked up, and then he said, "We will be known by what we refuse." She thought of all the refusals that had made her. The door she had not opened in court. The city she had not burned when burning would have made her legend sleek and ugly at once. The little kindnesses she had refused herself. The little cruelties she had not learned to perform with a straight face. In the line of her refusals she could almost see the road she was on, though the fog would not lift. She put her hand on Quentyn's and felt the bones that had learned too much sun. "When the sun returns," she said, "we will feed the dragons more. I want them strong and patient." "They are not your patience," he said. "They are your power." "They are both," she said, and then let herself imagine the sky for a moment, so her heart did not grow cramped with corridors. The wind shifted again. On the day it did, she stood on the wall and tasted ash. Somewhere beyond the reach of her eyes, something large had burned. Not her doing. Not yet. She thought of the shape of the wedding ring on her finger, imagined it as a circle drawn around a map, and reminded herself that circles are not cages if you know where to cut. In the evening, after the council had frayed itself and been gathered in again, after the last messenger had taken his weight to the stables, after the last bow had been made to the last old man who demanded to be allowed to boast of what his father had owned, she sat with Quentyn in the small room with the repaired statue that the water made lovelier than it had a right to be. They did not speak. They watched the ripple of the fountain's surface, the way light made a moving roof. She found herself thinking not of wars or ships, but of the fact that here at least water so often meant play, and that something inside her had been taught that water was a wound. She put her hand into the basin and closed her fingers. When she lifted them, water fell out in a shape that scattered before it fully formed. "Tomorrow," she said. "I will meet the man with the horn." Quentyn nodded. "Tomorrow," he said. "We will see what music he makes, and if it is music we choose to dance to. It will not be. Then we will learn how to make silence sound like a song." She smiled at that. It was a poor man's courage and theirs. In the night, the city lay down like an animal that had learned how to rest with one ear open. The rain had ceased. The air felt scrubbed of something she had not known it contained. In the great dark below the palace, the dragons shifted, rebalanced, and waited in their slow wisdom. Above them, within arm's length, two people rested in a pause between demands. Dawn, when it came, would ask everything. She would give what she had always given, the part of herself that could be shaped without breaking. If she had bet her future on a plain prince who walked like a man remembering not to limp, it was because he had offered her something rarer than thunder. He had offered her a place to stand. Okay. Indeed. They came with the horn trussed in canvas as if it were a corpse. Men carried it in overlapping shifts, 6 at a time, with 2 waiting to take a grip when arms began to shake. The cloth made it stranger, not safer. Even swaddled, it drew the eye the way an old wound does through a sleeve, the way a scar changes the shape of a man's walk more than the scar itself. They brought it up the river road with blades sloped low, and faces set, as if the heat had offended them personally. Behind the canvas came a priest with skin like polished walnut and hair, the color of night burned black, and behind him, the iron men who watched every door as if doors gave insult by existing. Victorian Greyjoy stood in the shade of a stretched leather awning that creaked like tired rigging. He had a face that history had battered into bluntness. Men made of that much stubborn seldom imagined their own mortality clearly. When he bowed, it was not deep. He had the manner of a man whose back had forgotten how to bend without a fight. He named himself in a voice that was mostly tide and little ornament. Behind him, the priest's eyes were steady as banked coals. Quentyn stood at Daenerys' right, Barristan at her left, their distances measured as if they were units on a map. Skahaz Mokandak had chosen to be visible today with a bronze beast's face and a sword whose scabbard made no sound. The Green Grace had sent a cousin with bracelets heavy enough to act as manacles if turned to that use. Dario was not in the line. He had offered to be invisible and faithful, a comedy he played very badly. "We do not keep you on the wall like beggars," Daenerys said, to cut the small talk from the air before it could stick. "You are guests while you choose to be guests." Victorian nodded, as if she had promised him weather that would not turn. "Guest friendship is a rope," he said. "You take the right end and I take the left and we pull the same way. Else it burns." "The priest will object to that metaphor," Garrus murmured behind his teeth. Nisande did not translate it more sweetly than it deserved. The priest watched the words go and did not blink. "I am Mokoro," he said, when it was his turn to speak. His voice was low and careful, as if the name were a piece of iron laid hot on an anvil. "I serve the fire that sees the shape of the night. I have no gods to trade with you," Daenerys said. "And this place is full of people who think their gods have found them already. If your god can make food and break sieges and cure a fever without burning a city, I will offer it a chair. If not, it must stand with the rest." Something like amusement touched the priest's mouth. A spark struck from wet wood. I have brought you a truth, he said, flicking his gaze toward the wrapped horn. And a warning. The truth is that words bind as surely as sinew. The warning is that some instruments take the breath that sounds them for payment. There is a writing on this horn that says the man who blows it dies, and the dragon will answer to the master named in the glyphs, not to the wind that carried the note. Dander. To whom does it answer? Quentyn asked. Speaking for the first time, with the square plainness he preferred for questions that mattered. To the one who bound the runes to it, said Moqorro. I can read the name in the old tongue. It is not a kindness to say it aloud. Then don't. Skahaz said, with a satisfaction that made the men near him stiffen. We have enough names in this city that make fools bow without knowing why. Victarion's jaw worked, not with anger. The motion looked habitual. I brought it for the queen, he said. I brought ships too. The sea is a better road than the sand. You want to go west. You have men who will drown rather than fight, or fight rather than listen. I have oars and men who can keep a blade dry in their teeth in a storm. Bind your dragons to my horn, and I'll bind my ships to your banner. We'll be wind and iron together. Then troll. And when we reach the far shore, Daenerys asked, how many of my oaths will you keep when the wind is not at your back? As many as suit me, he said, and the honesty of it was almost tender in its ugliness. I'll keep the ones that keep us winning. It was not the time to play with his pride. Pride was a fuse and the air too full of spark. Show me the horn, she said. Not its sound, just its face. Die. They peeled the canvas off as one lifts a blanket from a feverish child, sudden and wary. The horn lay there upon two trestles like a piece of some dead god's body. It was long as she was tall, banded with heavier metal that had drunk a black into itself deeper than soot. Symbols crawled along its length, the old letters that had grown like vines over stone and outlasted their gardeners. The mouth was ringed in patterns that made the eye want to follow a line that never returned to itself. When she stepped closer, heat rose from it, a warmth out of season, as if the horn remembered being on a hearth that no longer burned. The priest's hand hovered near the glyphs without touching. It knows its name, he said. It will not know mine, Daenerys answered, and the horn seemed to deepen in color a shade, or that was the trick of light. There was a hunger in the Iron Men's faces when they looked at it, the hunger men have for things that explain them to themselves. Barristan's hand rested not quite on his sword. Quentyn's hands hung open at his sides. Daenerys did not look past the horn toward the doors that led into the quiet under the pyramid. She did not need to. She felt rather than heard the faint tremor through stone when a chain shifted below. The dragons were not asleep. If you bring this into my city, she said, it will not speak. If it speaks, it will do so on the river with water on all sides, with no living thing within 2 bowshots. 3, Grey Worm said, his voice like a bar laid straight. 3. She agreed, and the man who blows it must be told what the priest says, and 3 times, and we must listen to him agree 3 times where all can hear. Victarion's mouth made a shape for scorn, and then swallowed it because scorn is a luxury when you need what you have come to ask. It will be blown, he said. We will see if old letters know new masters. Some masters do not age, Moqorro murmured. The Iron Captain's eyes flicked his way and then back. It was not clear whether he had heard or had spent too many years not hearing men he paid for advice when the advice did not flatter. They parted without insult. Men who did not love one another could still arrange to occupy the same day. When they carried the horn away, the room grew cooler by a breath. Missandei unrolled her list of names for the afternoon, and the afternoon lengthened like iron fresh out of a forge. When she and Quentyn were alone, the coolness lingered. It was not relief. It was the clean feel a wound gets when you pour water over it. I will have the pit cleared, she said. I will not be caught between chains and a song I do not own. Do not show him the dragons, Quentyn said. Do not teach him the map. I do not intend to show him anything that belongs to me," she said. "But there is a kind of foolishness that grows in men when they believe a thing because they have not seen it. I must decide which foolishness I will permit him." He considered that. He had a way of making space for a thought, rather than answering it. "Allow him to believe in the river," he said. "Allow him to believe that water blunts fire. Water does not." She said. "No," he answered, "but men do." The next morning they made of the river mouth a theater. Unsullied set stakes at measured intervals. Grey Worm walked them himself with a length of cord, and a pace counted in a language whose numbers sounded like pebbles. Boats were moored in a curve that left a stretch of current clean, the kind of clean that makes one suspicious. Men lined the quays, men who had learned to hawk rumor in handfuls. The priest arrived with the horn and a man he called volunteer, but whose eyes held the consent of someone who had been hungry yesterday, and had gambled on being less hungry in a world without tomorrow. Mokoro spoke the warning before everyone. The horn would have his life if it wanted it. The man nodded with the serenity of those who believe death will recognize them anyway. Victarion took his place as if the space had been drawn on the planks for his boots alone. The air had a weight to it, like the moment before thunder. Daenerys stood on the stone where the river grew sea-colored and let her hands hang quiet. Barristan's presence at her shoulder was a reminder of an earlier music. Quentyn's breath found hers and set itself beside it. The priest touched the horn once and then stepped back. The man who would blow it lifted it in both arms and looked smaller when it was against his chest, as all men do when holding something they hope will make them larger. He licked his lips. His mouth found the burn-rimmed ring. When the sound came, it did not seem to come into the air. It came into the bone. It came as if struck from the inside of the skull, a note that was not so much heard as suffered. Men flinched without moving. The water shivered around the pilings. The horn's voice rose and warped as if it had been dragged through a gate that had not fully opened. On the second heartbeat, the note sank and filled. On the third, it bit. The blower tried to pull away and could not. The sound owned him for as long as it pleased. Daenerys took one step without meaning to. The horn ended abruptly, cut off like a word bit short by a blow. The man fell to his knees. The skin of his mouth had gone a deep, ugly red. Smoke curled up from between his lips as if he had swallowed a coal. He pitched forward, and the horn tipped from his hands like a log rolling off a scaffold. It rang once where the metal band struck plank, an ordinary sound after, almost ridiculous in its small good sense. Below the city, iron rattled. In the earth, something tried to stand. Daenerys felt the chain hum in the soles of her feet, the way one feels a cart in the street before the wheel comes into view. Rhaegal slammed against his links once, then again. Viserion made a sound that she had never heard from him, a harsh, uncertain rasp that opened into fury. The river threw up a sheet of greenish spray that brought the stink of weed and old fish and rope. Men shouted without wanting to. The Unsullied did not move. Grey Worm's voice was a cut of iron in the din. "Down," he said. And it was not a command to kneel. It was an angle. She started for the stairs, Quentyn with her, Barristan turning the way a bodyguard turns when he must be shield and sword. She did not run. Running would have taught the wrong lesson to men who had come here to be schoolmasters. In the darkness under the pyramid, Rhaegal's eye caught her as he wrenched at the line and the iron sang. Viserion's mouth vented heat, like a kiln trying to speak. The air was pain. It had changed shape. Wow. She could taste the horn's note still, turning everything to the flavor of struck iron. She spoke in the voice she had taught them when they were small enough to creep into her lap like cruel children. She put her hands up and made them flat, and showed them meat with her other hand, and was glad for the half-dozen tethered goats, whose fear at least made sense today. Quentyn kept outside the circle of their rage and did not pull his fear all the way out of himself. And she loved him for that restraint, because dragons did not respect lies. The pain in the air did not last. It was not a memory that the pit could hold. It thinned, and when it had thinned enough that Viserion's frenetic breath settled into something less ragged, Rhaegal came forward and banged his forehead into the chain post with a rattle like beads struck together in a child's hand. She spoke until the world came back into the colors it had had before, until her lips tasted of old copper and her throat of smoke. When they climbed again, Victarion was waiting with a hunger in his face that had gone past hunger into a kind of rawness. He had seen nothing of what had happened below. He had watched a man die and had heard a sound, and his mind had made a bridge between that and his desire and walked it with solemnity. Mokoro had his hand on the horn's band as if the touch told him something the eye could not. There was a silence on the quay so complete that even the gulls seemed to hold their cries. "It will bind them," Victarion said, quiet as if standing in a temple. "We will make a fleet out of sky." "You will bind nothing with that but death," Daenerys said. And her voice shook not because it was afraid but because the horn's note had shaken the air it needed. "And the name carved on it is not yours." Victarion's mouth made a shape that might one day have turned into laughter if given meat. "Names can be taken," he said. "Some cannot." Mokoro's eyes lifted from the black. "Some take you instead." "We will not blow the horn again within my hearing," Daenerys said. And Grey Worm's chin shifted a quarter inch, enough to become a promise. "If you bring it into my city after today, it comes under my order, and I will drown it if I must. If it cannot drown, I will find another end for it." Victarion looked at the river as if consulting an old friend's face for advice. "You could come without it," he said, almost musing. "You could come in my ships and leave your beasts in their hole. Kings have won crowns without fire. I've done more with oars than most men do with prayers. Bendarau. I have no wish to be most men," she said. And for a heartbeat saw Viserys' pale hair, and the way he had always been trying to walk through a door that would not open. "And I am not a king," he grunted in acknowledgement. Whether of her correction, or of some private thought of his own, she could not tell. "Think on it," he said, as if thought were the thing that had been lacking. They left with their cloth and their iron, and the city exhaled. Daenerys did not. The horn's voice had extended a hand into her house, and moved things around, and then withdrawn without putting anything back where it had been. She sat with Quentyn in the little garden that looked like a preserved green memory of a happier century. The statue's mended cheek took the afternoon's light. The fountain fell into its own circle. "If I had not heard it," she said, "I would have called it superstition. I would have believed myself above it and been right and still wrong." "Ben?" Quentyn lowered his head until his chin almost touched his chest, the posture of a man checking the fit of his humility. "You cannot keep them all from our door," he said. "You must work the latch." "I know," she said. "I will not give him what he asks. Not that horn and not my beasts. But I will give him something. It is a habit of mine. When men bring me an insult, I hand them a courtesy and tell them to chew it slowly. It makes them clumsy." "What courtesy?" "His men are hungry," she said. "Not starving, not yet, but hungry in the particular way men get when they pretend to be full in front of their captains. We can give them a market at the dock twice a week. We can let their cooks in with coin and have brazen beasts watch and make the watching look like nothing. If they buy our onions and our fish and our cheap wine, they will care how the price moves, and it is harder to rip up a road you have me shored with your own strut." "You are teaching me to have a taste for onions," he said, and his mouth almost smiled. "Dorne will claim the glory of it. Dorne can have the glory," she said. "I will keep the onions." The market did not solve anything. Markets do not. They move the reasons for murder a street or two in one direction and call that peace. But the Iron Men came with their coins and their hard-mouthed jokes and learned the way the sellers cheated and were cheated back and once laughed. That was enough to show Skahaz where to put 3 men with quiet hands at a corner he had not previously chosen. Hisdar sniffed as if unable to decide whether the air smelled like profit or insult. The Green Grace sent a boy to tell Daenerys that her generosity was noted by the gods. The boy looked like he had rehearsed the line so often that it had become paste on his tongue. In the nights after the horn, the dragons were different. Not wild, that would have been a relief of its own sort. They were intent. They slept as cats sleep, one eye open, dreaming foot ready to run. When she sat in the pit with her back against the gate and the lantern at her feet, they watched it with her, as if all three of them were men on a wall counting torches to see how many enemies waited down the road. She fed them with her own hands until the sheen came back to their hides and the harried look left their breath. Quentyn came sometimes and did nothing, which was the exact right contribution. Barristan came once and told her an old tale of a horn in Old Town that had been said to bring down walls, and had turned out to bring down men's good sense instead. Nisande brought water. Grey Worm brought silence. It was a good quorum. Letters piled in like drift after a storm. Doran's hand grew, if anything, steadier, as if each line were a stake hammered deeper. The 10 ships had left Planky Town under 3 captains who had chosen not to share an argument, and had agreed instead to be men together for a handful of weeks. A rare covenant. 4 more ships had been laid down, their ribs taking shape in a chore of patience that could not be ordered to hurry. He told her what she already knew about Volantis, and then told her something she did not. Which slave trading houses had cousins who did not approve of their cousins' dinners, which men could be pried loose with a son's shame. He did not command. He suggested. It was a better way to help than most men understood how to offer. In a letter written in a different hand and sealed inside his, Ariane Martell asked what fabrics were worn in Marine, and whether her brother had seemed happy. The questions were knives wrapped in silk. Daenerys answered both with care, and did not lie. She said the cloth here was heavy or light, with almost nothing in between, and that Quentyn had the look of a man who wore something too large for him with a stubborn kind of grace. She said he would grow into it if allowed to, and that she had meant to allow it. She asked at the end whether the water garden smelled of oranges at dusk or of stone. The answer came back with a line of laughter pressed into it. Both, and of children. She found in those days that there were hours when her griefs did not press at the edges of all things. Her husband, she had begun to taste the word without flinching at it, had a talent for sharing a room without requiring that it be renamed for him. He had learned the courtyards that caught morning light and the ones that were bearable at noon. He knew which cook salted the lentils, as if she were making up for a lifetime of not being allowed to weep. He learned the names of 3 boys who carried water and could count on a straight wage. He made himself known to the unsullied by drilling quietly in the shadow of their practice yard. With a short spear he would never master, and the patience not to pretend he had. Men do not always need to be impressed. Often they need only not to be insulted. When the struggle beneath the walls flared, it did so not in one place but like a rash over the city's skin. A freedman beaten at a stall by a man in a gold mask with hands soft as papayas. A knife slid under a door and found the tender hollow behind a knee. A girl gone missing who returned with a bowl of figs, and a silence so complete the fruit rotted in her lap uneaten. Skahaz's men wore their beast faces and moved like shadows. Hisdar's smile acquired a curl at one corner, as if someone had tried to correct it and stopped halfway through. The green grace held to her calm with tremendous art. It is difficult work to play a god's patience when men spill their sudden, common blood at your feet. Grey Worm put 2 lines of unsullied between 2 warehouses, and let rumor do the work of iron. The tattered prince sent a man to say that his price had changed again, and that the change had a reasonable shape, if viewed from the right angle. Dario brought her 3 heads one morning, and a chain of small blue stones he said had cost him nothing. The truth of both claims did not matter as much as the way he told them, with a hunger for her attention that had deepened into a kind of ghost of itself. She listened, and she did not send him away. She could not afford to. One afternoon that sagged like a hammock between bad mornings and worse evenings, a scribe came puffing from the quays with surprise shining through sweat on his face. A small fleet with sun and spear sails had been sighted. The crowd began to take shape on its own along the river road, the way water takes the shape of a cup without asking what it is to be. Daenerys went down to the gate between Quentyn and Barristan, both dressed like men with more to prove than to display. The ships were honest things, not pretty, bellies fat with what they carried, and bearing the scars of seas that do not remember the names of men. When the first captain knelt, his knees cracked loudly enough to be a prayer. He was older than Doran by years, and looked born to tie a knot, and refused to let go. "From Sunspear, your grace," he said. "With cedar and tar and 5 men who can lay a keel without needing to be asked twice. The rest are boys who will learn fast if their fingers are asked to." She wanted to kiss the man's salt-cracked knuckles. She settled for asking his name and remembering it. They walked the quay while the city watched them, and the men shouted numbers to one another that turned into crates and coils and the sudden good smell of pitch. Quentyn's face did not change, but she saw something loosen behind his eyes. A hook taken out. A muscle stopped from clenching. People talk of armies as if they are made of swords. They are made, mostly, of men who know how to put wood into other wood and make it stay. Of women who can turn a sack of beans into 12 bowls and still have some to salt for tomorrow. She stood there in her city and felt for a breath the difference between wish and plan. If we cut their blockade in one place, Barristan said that night over a map that bore sand in its creases, we must cut it where men think it sacrilege to be seen. Here, he put a finger where the river's mouth widened and the bottom turned treacherous. No captain expects a queen to choose mud. Mud is patient, Quentyn said. And he was not wrong. And it hides the footprint of the man who steps through it. They argued the way people argue when they love the same thing in different languages. The windblown sent a messenger to say the price of their treachery had tripled. The second sons sent no messenger at all. The Iron Men shook themselves like dogs and promised storms. The plague found a new pocket of men to live in. The dragons ate an entire side of mutton each and went to sleep the way boys sleep after swimming, idiot and whole. Daenerys took a ride through the lower streets with only a dozen around her and a white cloak on Barristan that made men turn their heads. She did it because she remembered that people begin to speak of their rulers as if those rulers were places you could not get to without crossing a river. She stopped in a market where an old man was selling copper bowls so thin they rang when touched and told him to strike one for her. He did, and it sang in the small air. And she stood there like a fool and listened until the note ended, because sometimes you must show men how to wait for the end of a sound. When word came that Tyrion Lannister had been seen on the decks of a ship in the company of a sellsword band with a name like a lie, she did not feel the bolts shoot home in the doors of her heart. She felt only the old familiar ache that comes with an addition to the list of men with more cleverness than mercy and mouths made to bite the hands that bid them and the hands that did not. She did not send for him. Men like that arrive whether invited or not, and a queen must save her invitations for those who will understand what they cost. The green grace pressed again for the reopening of the pits. Peace needs bread and spectacle, she said, and bread is dear. The priests had a litany of things the gods required, all of which looked to Daenerys suspiciously like things the men who fed those gods required to keep from losing face. Izdar's sentences turned upon themselves as snakes do when playing at being bracelets. Skahaz wanted heads. Barristan wanted time. Quentyn wanted ships. She wanted the world to stop asking her to choose among bad fathers. She did not reopen the pits. She allowed one small trial in a yard ordinarily used to dry cloth. It was not for men. It was for the city to watch itself. 2 boys fought with blunted spears until their arms shook, and then were called off and given water and a piece of bread that they broke between them without being asked. The crowd shouted for blood anyway, and then, when blood stubbornly refused to be the point, drifted away complaining as if cheated of a story. That was the shape of Meereen. It would not be saved by forced piety or by making an altar of its appetites. It would be saved, if at all, by the worst miracle. Boreholes in ships sealed on a night that rained, a tub of clean water in a lane that yesterday held none. A queen who did not drown when men tried to teach her to swim with stones at her neck. There was a morning when Drogon returned, not in a blaze of redemption, but as if he had remembered a thing he needed to do, and it happened to be in this city. He came out of the east with the sun behind him, and threw his shadow across 3 boats, and half a market, and most of the palace. Men fell to their knees because men do, and because a god that wears no face but heat and teeth is easier to honor than a woman who asks you to wash your hands before you break bread. He circled once and twice, and then fell toward the roof with laziness that was not laziness, only the knowledge that the air belonged to him. She went up without allowing herself to think. Rhaegal and Viserion woke in the pit below with a chorus of chain talk that ran through the stone. Drogon landed on the parapet as if placing a foot on a high dune. His eyes were coin flat and then not. There was recognition there, and an insult too, because he remembered her, but also remembered that she had stayed. And that is something dragons do not understand. She stood 3 paces off and lowered her head the way she had learned to with beasts that could turn you to bone with a twist of their neck. She said his name. It was not the right language for him. Names in mouths are always the language of the one speaking them. He forked the air with a short cough of flame and scorched a half of parapet black, and did not burn her because he had not meant to. Quentyn stood where he should stand, within her reach, and not in Drogon's. Barristan did not raise a spear because a spear is an invitation. The city held its breath with an artistry it rarely showed in anything else. Drogon slammed his tail and dust rolled into the sky in a slow, stupid column that would make men cough later and curse dragons in their wives' ears. He watched her. She let him. She did not ask him to be what he was when he was small. She did not ask him to choose her over the wind. After a time, she could not have said how long. He shook himself like a dog and launched, and the roof shuddered as he left, and she felt the old lovely terror course through her like clean water. Victarion came the day after with a face dark as a storm's belly. The horn had made the dragons remember, and he thought the remembering was his. He did not say so. He did not need to. Men who believe a thing should happen cannot entirely avoid believing that they have caused it. He asked again for her to climb his oars and leave her fire in its cage. He offered an island in passing as if he were sweeping crumbs off a table to a beggar. She told him of the market and the onions, and that he would have neither if he brought the horn where she could hear it. He left a rope behind him when he went, a rope made of pride and weather. She could decide later whether it was a noose or a mooring. When Tyrion finally stood before her, he did not stand. He lounged because he could not help it. Like a dog that will sit only when it is sure the sitting was its own idea first. He bowed as an actor bows when he cannot assume the audience will clap, and has decided he will not be smaller for their neglect. He offered her his tongue, and she did not take it. She took instead the half-dozen small truths that men like him cannot keep from falling out of their mouths in the first minutes. The number of guards on the quay ladder, the fact that one of the captains of the Windblown had a cut on his hand that would go bad if not treated, the speed at which news moved along the river when carried by women washing linen and not by men carrying orders. He did not offer loyalty. He offered usefulness. That was an honesty she could use. Quentyn watched him with the patience he had learned from staring at horizon lines and trying to calculate wind from the way the light knifed the water. Barristan watched him with a wearied respect. One swordsman gives another across a hall empty of truth. Grey Worm watched him the way soldiers watch dogs in unfamiliar camps. Daenerys did not ask him what he wanted. Men like that always want a throne or a bed, and are too clever to say so plainly. She asked him if he had any idea how to make a fleet stop being itself for an afternoon. Ships are only men who chose wood, he said, amused. Give them a better choice, or make them regret the one they made. Sinking is a fine argument. So is being paid more than the man who used to pay you. So is fear. So is boredom. Use all 4. He spoke of the second sons, of Brown Ben Plum's affection for both coin and living, of the way a company's honor is a whore whose price rises when a rival walks into the room. He spoke of the Windblown's announced price and their unannounced price, and of how to put a finger where a man's pride had left a door ajar. He spoke of Volantis and of priests who had learned to wrap their greed in smoke like a sweetmeat so cloying men forgot to spit. He spoke of his sister with careful venom that told Daenerys more than his words did. That the hurt was old, that the shape of it had carved something in him that would go on shaping. He spoke until his wine ran out and did not ask for more, which was his first act of wisdom in her house. She did not embrace him as a savior. She did not put him in a cell for being his father's son. She set him to a table with Missandei and 2 scribes, and asked him to write the names of men whose loyalty could be measured in gold, in fear, in boredom, in any currency he understood. He began at once. Quentyn watched him and said very little, and then, a day later, sent to ask for the names of men in the Windblown who liked oiled wood more than war. The list came back with 3 names on it, and 2 circles and 1 question mark. It was enough to stage the smallest of collisions on the wrong day, under the wrong captain, to make the right men curse their company aloud within earshot of the right ears. That same week, a child died in the palace, and no one had the courage to say aloud that she had died of something that the water carries. The household made a fuss of figs and chopped mint and meat, spiced as if the mouth could be bribed into believing it was tasting a different world. Daenerys went to the mother and did not promise her a justice that could not exist. She sat with her while the woman wept the kind of tears that make a room feel smaller, and the kind that make the room larger and dangerous. Quentyn sat in the doorway and did not speak. When the child was carried out, he went to the river and spoke to a man who built cisterns. No ceremony, no scribes. And the next morning 10 boys with shovels stood where the man had pointed and began to turn the earth. It did not make her a better queen. It made water stand where water had been told to. And that was not nothing. The city learned new habits as animals do in winter. Slowly, with resentment, then all at once. Men went to the market, set for the Iron Men, and came back talking of the price of onions, as if it had always mattered. Women brought buckets to a new trough, and then the next day, to the same trough without asking why it did not smell as the old one had. 2 brazen beasts who had thought their masks made them gods were taken apart by their fellows, because the masks had made them worse than men. The tattered prince lowered his price and asked for different coin. The windblown had 3 small accidents and 1 big one, and decided they were unlucky, and that luck could be changed if one changed captains. On a day when the air felt thin, and the light had the spidery quality of a morning that has been bled by too many nights, Doran's second letter arrived to say the first 10 ships were in sight of Marine, and the 4 behind them half built enough to have the smell of their future. He wrote that he had sent not only cedar and tar, but 2 men who had once built river barges for rich Tarly on the Mander, and had been willing to come east for the chance to do work that would live in a song. He wrote that Arianne had said something clever and mean about the Lannisters that he would not repeat, because he wished to live long enough to meet his grandchildren. He wrote that he hoped her dragons were growing strong, and that when she came west, he would feed them oranges, and see if they spat out the peel or chewed it like fools. She laughed aloud reading it, and Quentyn, hearing the sound, smiled like a man feeling sun on the back of his neck after a month of wind. The decision to leave was not a decision. Decisions have edges. This had none. It arrived as a recognition that the scales would never balance, and that the trick had always been to step away from the balance altogether and walk. She told the council not that she was going, but that the city would go on when she did, and that they were to make sure that it did so under the laws she had given it, and not under the old ones that too many men's hands knew how to pull tight. Skahaz scowled and said he would bite any hand that came near the throat of what they had built. Hizdar smiled as if already planning the speeches he would give. The Green Grace murmured a line about the river knowing where it must go. Grey Worm asked how many men would stand on which ship, and in what order, and for how many days. Barristan bowed as if she had just done the thing he had been praying for without daring to name it. Quentyn touched her wrist where no one could see. Victarion came to her again when the Martell banners were a whisper of color on the horizon, and said, with a satisfaction that was almost soft, "It turns out you'll need a road after all." "I have one," she said. "It is made of men who keep their oars moving, without asking whether they are the first or the last." He grunted. "We will race," he said, as if anyone had asked to make a game of it. "My ship's against your patience. Men who race forget to look at the weather," she said. "It is a good way to drown." He laughed at that, a bark that was as much cough as mirth. "I have drowned 3 times, he said. "The sea spat me out each time. It doesn't like the taste of me. Then stop trying to feed it," she said, "and let him make of that what he would." In the last night she went to the pit, and sat in the iron-smelling dark, and spoke to her beasts. She told them of the water and the wood, and the men who would fear them, and pretend not to, and of the men who would fear them, and learn from the fear, and be better for it. She told them they would fly over a sea that had swallowed kings, and that she would not ask them to pretend to be tame. She asked only that they remember her voice and the shape of her hand, and the place in themselves where the part of her that burned lived. They did not answer her in any language she could repeat. They shifted and breathed, and watched the lantern flame, as if choosing to learn the trick of small fires before attending to the great. On the morning the first Martell ship tied up and made the quay look like a ribbon laid too tight around her wrist. She walked down with Quentyn and Barristan and Grey Worm and Missandei and Skahaz and Dario, and the weight of a city arranged behind her, not as a burden but as a kind of test. Men will live without you. That is the liberation and the insult of power. Nothing is yours, not even what you have bled for. She had her hand on the smooth, worn rail of the gangplank when a cry went up from the roof, and shadows crossed the river like the play of clouds. Drogon, and behind him Rhaegal with his chain still caught a yard from its iron and dragging it like a toy, and Viserion with his mouth half open to taste the change in the air. Grey Worm's hand lifted and stopped and lowered. Barristan's eyes filled with a boy's light. Quentyn made a sound in his throat that might have been a prayer and might have been the word for wind in a language that had never bothered to tell the difference between hope and weather. She did not raise her arms as a priest does to bless a thing he wishes to own. She raised them as a woman does when she is not ashamed to be small before what is hers. Drogon slid like a storm to the palace roof and landed as lightly as a man sets his hand on a sleeping child's head. Rhaegal's chain caught on the corner of the parapet and swung and clanged, and then, with a sound like a bell struck underwater, snapped. Viserion tasted the river with a lash of flame that set no more than a skiff's paint to blistering. Men fell to their knees not from piety, but because the ground wanted them, suddenly, and they were wise enough to accept the invitation. "Come," she said, and did not know whether she said it to the dragons, or to the ships, or to the city, or to her husband. Quentyn's hand found hers and squeezed once, not for comfort, but to say present. Present, as a soldier does when his name is called in a room of dead men. They boarded without ceremony, because ceremony is for those who can afford the attention of gods. The ship smelled of rope and tar and an old pickle barrel. The river slapped them like a friend trying to jolt sense or courage into a sulking man. The iron men on their decks beyond the market watched and chewed and spat and looked at their captains for cues that did not come. The windblown affected to be bored. The second sons affected to be indifferent. Everyone waited to see what the dragons would do. Drogon did what he always did, what pleased him. He leapt into the air and drew 2 long strokes over the river, and then rose, and his shadow widened and passed over the men mending net, and the boys stealing fruit, and the women yelling at both, and over Victarion's decks, and the priest's eyes, and the green and white flags, and the black hulls, and the old stone where 2 children had once tied reeds, pretending to fish. He climbed until he was a small black nail pinning a piece of the sky to itself, and then was gone into the impossible blue. Rhaegal and Viserion followed less cleanly, making errors in the air that were not weaknesses but signatures. They rose. The city breathed. The horn lay on its trestles somewhere in the iron men's tents like a threat already spoken. Daenerys turned her face west. The air that came off the water had the taste of ships in it. Salt and pitch and men's breath and something else. The very old breath of a world that does not care whose name you write on a horn. Quentyn stood at her side, Barristan behind her. Grey Worm at the gangplank with his spear at the angle he liked best, because it made men stand straighter when they looked at it. Missandei with a list she would not need, and a memory that had already written a better one. Skahaz with his mask tucked at his belt like a promise he was keeping for later. Dario with his smile duller than it had been, and perhaps more honest. Above them, shadow wrote, and unwrote itself on the water. Meereen would remain, as cities do, just as indifferent, and just as amazed to find itself awake the next morning. The camps would sicken. The plague would crave. The green grace would find new words for old things. The tattered prince would change prices and call that loyalty. Victarion would oil the horn with a care a mother gives her last child, and imagine that the day bent its knee to his will. Doran Martell would write in a hand that did not shake. Arianne would laugh and want and plan. The world would move toward her with intent. She would move toward it under a banner that had been hers before she had learned to spell her name. She did not pray. She counted. She counted the breaths between the creak of wood and the slap of water. She counted the ore banks on a ship that was not hers. She counted the ways in which men had already died for her, and the ways in which she would not allow that to have been for nothing. She counted her dragons and the beats between the moments when she could see them, and the moments when she could not. She counted until the numbers stopped being numbers and became steps. She took the first of them. The city slid away like a mirage that had become honest at last, and receded not because it denied itself, but because the world was large, and she had chosen to be in it. Quentyn did not speak until they had cleared the last of the boats at anchor, and the river widened to take the sea's name. "There is a saying at the water gardens," he said. "Children must be taught where to swim and where to sit. No one says where to drown." "We will not drown," she said, and did not add the foolishness that follows such certainty. "We will not be taught either." He nodded at that. The small, stubborn bow of a man who had learned to be a weed, and considered it a profession. Wind took his hair and made it untidy. It had never been particularly obedient. Barristan lifted his face into the same wind like a hound catching a remembered scent. Grey Worm narrowed his eyes and catalogued the angles at which men might approach them. Missandei's lips moved as she counted something only she knew the tallying of. Skahaz spat into the water. Dario grinned at his reflection and was irritated to find it grinning back. The ship turned its nose toward the line where the world ends and begins again, depending on where one stands. The oars took up their measured quarrel with the river. The sails heaved and then filled. Far above, a shadow crossed the sun and made a ladder of light across the deck. She put her hand on the rail and felt it answer her. Somewhere behind, a horn lay quiet and black, full of a music she would not let into her house again. Somewhere ahead, a throne that was not a chair waited to be called by the name of the thing it truly was. A weight that must be shared, or it breaks the spine of the one who tries to carry it alone. She would not carry it alone. That was the whole of it, the lesson that had taken her this far to learn, and would take her the rest of her life to keep. She turned to Quentyn and found his eyes steady. She turned to the water and found it moving. She turned to the sky and found it full. She breathed. The world breathed with her, and if it did not, she told herself that it did until the lie became the one true thing left, which is another way queens make the weather they need to travel. Night would come. Men would argue about anchors. Dragons would vanish and reappear and make maps of warmth across the dark. Someone would bring her a lemon sweet enough to make her think of another world, and she would put it away because she had eaten too many memorials and needed bread. She stood and learned the movement of the ship, and let it teach her where to put her feet, so that when the swell broke, she would not fall. It is something all queens must master sooner or later. In a better world they would learn it in gardens. In this one there was only the deck, and wind, and a man with a plain face and a patient heart, and the sound of wings somewhere above the world trying to remember how to sing itself into being once more.